Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Tanya Launhecht. I'm Communications Director at Outdoor Alliance. I'm in Portland, Oregon, which is the traditional land of many tribes, as I've just been learning since I just moved. They include Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and others that lived along the Columbia River. I am super excited for our webinar today and for our panelists who have just such a wealth of information, ideas, and insights into 30 by 30 and the path to making it happen. We've had some really incredible discussions leading up to this, and I'm excited for our conversation today and everything they have to share. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. We'll go in alphabetical order. So that's Gabe, Jen, Levi, Lewis, and Pete.
Thank you so much, Tanya, and buenas tardes to everybody. My name is Gabe Vasquez. My pronouns are he, him. I am calling in today from Las Cruces, New Mexico, the land of the Mescalero, Apache, Pido-Manso-Tiwa, and ancestral lands of the Jornada Mogollon people. I am a city councilor here in the city of Las Cruces, and I'm also a board member for the Outdoor Alliance. I am a hunter, an angler, trail runner, amateur turkey hunter, as Lewis and I were just talking about turkey season coming up here in southern New Mexico. But I'm also a conservationist, and I also grew up with the values that my grandfather instilled in me to conserve and protect the things that we love in the outdoors. And here in the Chihuahuan Desert in southern New Mexico, so much of our lifestyle, our culture, and our livelihoods revolve around the land, and they revolve around our culture. And they revolve certainly around people's connection to this special place. And so I'm excited to be here with you all today. Thank you so much, Tanya.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Savage. I'm the California Policy Manager for the Surfrider Foundation. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm here zooming in from the ancestral and current home of the Wiyot tribe. Most of you would know that as Humboldt County, California. So I'm very lucky to live on a peninsula adjacent to Humboldt Bay, which means I get to spend a lot of time in both the Pacific, preferably on a surfboard, as well as kayaking around Humboldt Bay and hiking in the great redwoods around here. So it's a wonderful place to be if you love the outdoors, which I assume most people tuning into this do. So thank you very much for having me today. Looking forward to this discussion.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hey, those were good introductions, Gabe and Jen. My name is Levi Rose, and I'm the Land Use Planning and GIS Manager for Outdoor Alliance. I am based in Spokane, Washington, so that's northwest or northeast Washington, and these are the traditional homelands of the Spokane tribe. And I look forward to the conversations this afternoon. Pass it over to Lewis.
I'm Lewis Geltman. I'm the Policy Director for Outdoor Alliance. I'm calling in from White Salmon, Washington in the Columbia River Gorge, which is the traditional and current home of the Yakima.
And hey everyone, my name's Pete Stopper. I'm the Environmental Director for Surfrider Foundation. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm calling in from San Clemente, California, which are the lands of the Hashiman Nation, and great to be here.
Thank you all. So before kicking things off with our conversation, I wanted to start with just a brief introduction of where the idea for this webinar came from and how we're approaching this a little bit at Outdoor Alliance. So over the past year, I think we've started to see how a lot of the major issues we're trying to tackle in the conservation space are really interconnected. So from public land conservation to biodiversity, climate crisis, equity concerns, and access for outdoor recreation. I think also the last year has really brought into sharp relief how urgent it is that we tackle these issues. I imagine for a lot of us here today, access to the outdoors has been especially important in the last year, as we've navigated the pandemic and so many other activities have not been possible. For me, time outside with my family this year has been like the small thread between me and sanity. And it's been a really important personal reminder of why I'm in the conservation space as well. So we've seen a lot of growth in outdoor recreation participation in the past year. People are looking for more places to get outside, closer to where they live. The pandemic has also made clear that there are real disparities in who has access to the outdoors, and that has generated a lot of energy and policy ideas around building pathways to more equitable access, which is far overdue. It's also been a reminder that the climate crisis is intensifying. From the catastrophic wildfire season, I was in California for the last wildfire season, and it was really terrifying, to the recent weather that happened in Texas and shut down parts of the South. These climate impacts, of course, are not distributed evenly across the US. The impact of climate change is disproportionately felt by Black and Brown communities, and that's in large part because of policy failures. Outdoor Alliance, we've been focused on land conservation, among other things, since our inception. For those who might not be as familiar, we're a coalition of recreation organizations. So we think about conservation through the lens of people and their experiences. But of course, we're also thinking about the wider benefits for clean air, clean water, habitat, and climate when we're advocating to protect land and water. So when we started reading about 30 by 30 a few years ago, we were really excited to see the science developing, to see a number on how much land we needed to conserve. And it was also really compelling to see the threads between land conservation, conserving biodiversity, protecting the climate, and enhancing equitable access pulled together in this campaign that started to gather a lot of broad support. And our team has spent a lot of time, especially over the last year, over many Zoom calls and phone calls and discussions, thinking about what 30 by 30 means, how the outdoor community can be involved. If we're going to protect 30% of our land and waters, how do we decide what protected means? What kind of places would be the most helpful to protect for both climate and for human beings? How do we generate support from lawmakers that will outlast any particular administration? And we're pretty optimistic about how pursuing this goal might be an opportunity to address a lot of these interconnected threats: biodiversity collapse, climate change, equitable access, the need for more accessible outdoor spaces. And 30 by 30 offers an interconnected and holistic way to approach those challenges. I wanted to also recognize that this idea and our work on it has gotten a lot of support from really amazing partners, foundations, folks in the outdoor industry, lawmakers, individuals, many of whom might be joining us today. So there's been a lot of people helping all of us think through this idea and advocate for these ideas with our elected officials and help it gain as much momentum as it has. So I'm really excited for what our panelists are going to share today. I'm excited to learn from all of you. And for those of you who might be a little new to Zoom or maybe just want the refresher, if you want to chat, there's a chat box in the bottom. And then if you want to add questions for our panelists at any point, you can drop them in. There's like a little Q&A, and that helps them not get lost in the chat. So if you have questions along the way, add them to the Q&A, and we'll save time at the end to address those. I will also be recording this, and we'll send it out along with some other materials when we're done. So let's get started. I want to start with the background of 30 by 30 for anyone who might be new to the idea or just want to hear where it came from. Maybe Louis and Levi, you could start by talking a little bit about where the idea for 30 by 30 came from.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess 30 by 30 for us, or our journey with 30 by 30, we really came into it by way of these House and Senate resolutions calling for protection of 30% of lands and waters by 2030. And, you know, we saw these things and we started reading and looking at it, and it's talking about, you know, this really holistic approach to conservation, protecting really wild, pristine backcountry places, but also protecting working landscapes, front country places, enhancing access to the outdoors. And it was something that really spoke to our sensibilities as a, you know, conservation advocacy organization, because we try to work on a real diversity of landscapes and in a flexible way. So we wanted to really kind of like do our due diligence before we jumped into this thing, because it sounds like a little cute, right? Like this idea of 30 by 30, like, is this really laced up by the science, or is this just like a branding thing, or like, what's the story here? And so we started really like digging in and learning about the science underpinning this 30 by 30 goal, which comes out of you know, a set of scientific papers talking about what's necessary to avoid biodiversity collapse. And those papers led to a proposal for a global deal for nature, which is intended to be a companion to the Paris Climate Accord. And it calls for protecting 30% of the world's lands and waters and oceans by 2030 as a step on the way to protecting 50% of the Earth by 2050. And so, as we dove into this, it's a little bit of a different way of thinking about conservation, I think, than we typically do. I think that because we're all coming at it from an outdoor recreation background, I think for most of us, conservation feels like self-evidently good. And we talk a lot about just sort of the intrinsic value of place and also the social value of place. But thinking about the science underpinning this really urgent need for conservation, I think that was, I don't know, like a little bit of a change for us in some ways maybe. But recognizing what that science calls for, how much that aligns with our approach, and how much that aligns with our desire to make a contribution through public lands management to mitigating the effects of climate change. I think that really spoke to us, and the potential for this effort to tie together our goals around making public lands and waters and all lands and waters a part of climate solutions, giving us this opportunity to make a contribution to this really important environmental effort around biodiversity protection, and also protecting the outdoor recreation experience and enhancing equitable access to the outdoors. That was kind of the beginning of our journey into this and kind of the underpinnings of this effort.
Will you share just for one minute about biodiversity? Because we've been talking a little bit about, I kept talking about climate, and you kept reminding me that the main initial goal of 30 by 30 was about biodiversity. Would you talk about that for just a second?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I think Levi can probably speak to it more thoroughly than I can, but basically, this is what the science calls for to prevent a collapse of global biodiversity, which is, bad just as a, I don't know, sort of self-evidently bad, but it's also bad for people, right? It's like we depend on the natural world for sustenance and, ecosystem services and all of the aesthetic enjoyment we get out of the outdoors. And so, again, it's not really my area of expertise, but this is as important in a lot of ways as climate.
Yeah, I think there's some important things here that weren't necessarily, on our radar before we got into this, and biodiversity being one of them. But, just as a definition, biodiversity is the variance among plant and animal species in the environment. And when we talk about biodiversity hotspots, these are places where you have biologically rich ecosystems, but they're threatened, right? And so what we learned as we got into into the research is that the extinction rate for plant and animals has increased, and since we've actually started recording this, about 1,000 times. And right now there's about 1 million species at risk or threatened. And so I think that's part of the alarm in the science community. And then really what we're talking about is kind of coupling that together with climate change and how climate change can affect those species.
Thanks, guys. So it's a good background. I want to talk also about the current political and cultural context for 30 by 30. I was hoping, Gabe, you'd give the lay of the land of what point are we at? Why are we gaining so much traction now? What's been happening?
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Louis and Levi, for that explanation. I think first I'll just say I think it's really helpful to have the context of where the origins of 30 by 30 are, because like any slogan or any umbrella type of term, I'm sure folks rightfully so have skepticism and questions about where does this originate from and what's the goal here. And so You know, I think the larger context of what Levi and Lewis were mentioning does exist in the political realm. And I think we're at a time of, you know, overwhelming and bipartisan support, to be honest, of local and national conservation efforts, especially as we enter this conversation about climate change and what this administration can and will do to combat the impacts of climate change. And so this is this certainly is a piece of that puzzle. I think for me, you know, I see us also at a political time where we are in, you know, where ethnically and underrepresented communities no longer are outside the room. They no longer are just being offered one seat at a table, but they are setting the table, right? And I say that confidently because the conservation landscape, as I know it, as we know it, I think is changing. In particular, with the recent confirmation of the Honorable Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior. She's from my home state, and super proud to have her at the helm of this critical agency that will be tasked with carrying out some of these initiatives, at least on the federal side, but also working with state and local governments to accomplish 30 by 30 goals, but in a way that is much more inclusive than it has been before. The 30 by 30 concept has also been endorsed by the Biden-Harris administration. And so in the president's budget, he does specifically call out and lay out a budget for the Department of Interior that includes an addition of spending to help accomplish 30 by 30 goals. And so you have that, I think that marriage of both agency and administration, and certainly folks like the Council for Environmental Quality at the White House, the EPA and others will have a significant role in achieving this goal. I would just say that I think it's going to take local communities as much as it's going to take the federal government to help lead these efforts. And I think we're seeing tons of support on the local side and on the state side with diverse stakeholders, again, leading the way in different ways to get these goals accomplished. You know, I don't think we can no longer conserve, preserve, set aside, designate landscapes, whatever folks want, without the input and involvement of a more diverse group of stakeholders, and in particular, Native American communities. And so I think we're seeing people gelling around this concept of not just protecting land for the sake of protecting or conserving, but because people's cultures and history is intrinsically tied to the land and to the water. And so we are in a different political moment in that sense that I haven't seen in the conservation movement before. So right now, the Department of Interior has been tasked by executive order with creating essentially a roadmap or a report to say how this roadmap kind of, you know, lays out some very general top level plans of how we achieve this 30 by 30 goal, because there have been more questions than answers, and that's okay. Questions are good because it leads us hopefully to those good answers. And that roadmap will basically say, hey, these are different tools in the tool belt to get to 30 by 30. And it's not just going to be national monuments. It's not just going to be national conservation areas or wilderness designations or other federal tools. It's going to take local parks, right? It's going to take you know, really creative ways of working with private landowners and land trusts and other folks to create the type of wildlife habitat and the type of environmental restoration that we really need to achieve the goals of 30 by 30, which truly it is about biodiversity. But on the other hand, as you mentioned earlier, Tanya, it's also about making sure it's done right, making sure it's done fair in an equitable way, and that respects the people and the communities in those places where they interact with these new landscapes or with these new designations on existing landscapes, I should say. So once that report is created and delivered to the Biden-Harris administration, which DOI is working on now, I think we'll get a much better sense of what it means to help, you know, for us especially as an outdoor recreation community, to help move this goal forward and to better understand how we as outdoor recreationists coexist with this ambitious effort. So thank you, Tanya.
Yeah, thanks. That's really awesome context, and I really especially like the point about like the process being different for this, that it's not just about this really bold goal, but also about how we approach it. One of the questions that we asked ourselves, like the first day we started talking about this, is if we want to protect 30% of our land and waters, what counts as protected? Like what's gonna, you know, go into that bucket? And and where do we stand right now? So Levi, I'd love for you to talk about this, like all the data, all the GIS and mapping stuff, and you've looked into this more than just about anyone I know. So will you share your wisdom with us?
Yeah, sure. So what counts as protected may be the $1 million question. And as Gabe alluded, the agency heads have been tasked with trying to figure this out. And so we're expected to get that guidance at the end of April. And in the meantime, I think what we can talk about today is the USGS protected area database. And so in the House and Senate resolutions, they mentioned this figure of 12% of land protected in the US. And I think a lot of people may have seen that number, but maybe don't know the origins of where that came from. And so when Lewis and I started working on 30 by 30, like any good detective, we saw that number and we were like, hey, where'd that number come from? And it comes from the USGS Protected Areas Database. It's currently the nation's official inventory of public protected lands and conserved private lands. It's an amazing resource. And within the protected areas database, they kind of break down different levels of protections through what are called gap status codes. And I don't know if we want to go into too much detail about gap status codes, but gap status codes 1 and 2 generally reflect permanently protected lands that are free from extractive uses. And this is what the House and Senate resolutions number cites as a 12% is the combination of gaps 1 and 2.
Will you share that chart? I feel like that was really helpful for me in understanding it.
Yeah, let me throw that up.
And so maybe the important point here, or part of it, is that gap status codes 1 and 2, it seems to be that's sort of become the starting point for these conversations around what constitutes protection. But then there are a lot of things in gap status code 3 that seem like they're pretty good protections. And so, maybe that's some of the beginning of the conversation on, how do we migrate some of those things up into gap status code 1 and 2, but also, recognizing that a lot of the things that are within gap status code 3 do a really good job of protecting biodiversity and enhancing these other values that are, a part of 30 by 30, like enhancing access to the outdoors or climate mitigation. Is there some way to account for these protections that are sort of, maybe imperfect protections within the framework of 30 by 30?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And maybe for just some background, Tanya, can you see the screen okay?
I can. Will you show that other, that chart that shows like what is the gap status 1 and what's gap status 2?
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
This one. I felt like this was so helpful for me in understanding.
Yeah, so we're OA is creating an interactive story map, a tool to help folks understand better what protection is in the US. And so right here, this table reflects the default gap status codes for common land use designations. And so in gap 1 and 2, you can see wilderness areas, national monuments, national parks. These are examples of permanently protected areas in the US. And getting back to that 12% figure, you can see here gap 1 and 2 lands, if you combine the total around 293 million acres, that's roughly 12% of lands in the US. So yeah, is that helpful?
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks for going through that.
Yeah, let me take off the screen share here.
And hey, Levi, if I just may, the report that Outdoor Alliance put out on 30 by 30 is available on the OA website and includes that table. Is that right?
Yeah, the table is included in the appendix in the back. Yeah.
Okay, just for folks to have access to that.
Yeah. So we can talk, I guess, to go from here. Actually, we were going to talk a little bit about outdoor recreation, but I actually think it might be helpful to talk a little bit more about oceans, because we're like a little more terrestrial focused. And Pete and Jen, I was hoping you might talk a little bit about how these principles translate to oceans.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Once again, Pete Stauffer with Surfrider Foundation. We're a grassroots organization, and Jennifer and I and others in the Surfrider network have worked for decades on marine protected areas, and it can be a challenging process. It can be very divisive, but there's also a way, at least in our mind, to do it well. And so, organizationally, we've come up with some principles or some best practices in terms of not only actually designating protected areas and making sure they're durable, but also doing them in the right way, making sure we're addressing equity as well as socioeconomic factors. So kind of a few key factors that I'll run through, and then I'll turn it over to Jennifer, and she'll talk more specifically about what's happening in California. But I would say the number one thing is you need to know what your management goals are. So everyone needs to understand, here's why this designation is being created. Here are the goals, because that will drive everything in terms of the design, the management, what types of activities may be restricted. And also that will provide the context for then going back and evaluating. Is this protected area successful or not? Another really key aspect is communities and stakeholders must be involved. They're the ones that are going to tell you what are the local interests, what are the local concerns. Their input will help managers figure out how do you avoid or minimize impacts, but also how do you promote benefits in terms of economic development, or sort of sociocultural values. Obviously, having this kind of engagement, that's going to build hopefully a strong level of buy-in from the local community. And then building off what Gabe was saying, Native tribes, Native nations are really a critical partner in this work, not only with their local knowledge, the cultural resources that they bring, but also in many cases, they have an important legal role in this as well. Another key principle for us is protecting and enhancing recreation. And this is something that we see on the land side too, is we're really looking for those win-win situations. So, how can you create a protected area that will conserve the natural environment, but it will also provide opportunities for low impact, non-extractive recreation. Not only will that enhance public understanding and support, it can also enhance economic development and tourism. Public access is a key part of that. Surfrider works a lot on coastal access, and we see all kinds of barriers to people being able to access and enjoy the coast. So I think we look at 30 by 30 as being a potential venue to expand public access to the coast, and not just overcome those physical barriers, but other types of barriers. So for underserved or diverse communities that haven't had the same level of access, how can we use the 30 by 30 initiative to promote outreach and programs and partnerships to bring those communities and let them enjoy these resources. And then the final point I'll make, so important, science should drive decision-making. If we are going to achieve the goals that we set up for these protected areas, we have to look at the goals, and then we have to look at these management options, both from an ecological standpoint, but also from a socioeconomic standpoint. Use all the information that we have to really inform the design of that protected area, And then again, we can do scientific monitoring and then go back and evaluate, is this protected area actually achieving the goals, or do we need to somehow modify that designation? So with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer, and she'll talk a little bit more specifically about California.
Great, thank you, Pete. So I wanted to talk a little bit about California because not only is what's happening here echoing a lot of the themes that you've already heard, but California has really leapt into this leadership role. The state itself is considered one of 36 biodiversity hotspots in the world because we have such a high concentration of unique species that are also experiencing unprecedented threats. So we look at this 30 by 30 approach as a way to move beyond desperately trying to protect these endangered species to a more proactive approach aimed at keeping the thousands of animals and plants that coexist with us healthy and resilient to climate change. Last year, Governor Newsom catapulted California into this leadership role by issuing an executive order that directs our state agencies to advance 30 by 30 strategies in a manner that, quote, preserves biodiversity and natural resources, expands equitable outdoor lands and recreation for all Californians, and maintains our state's economic prosperity. And so to that end, the executive order also created the Biodiversity Collaborative, which is a new initiative tasked with creating a Pathways to 30 by 30 strategic report, much like Gabe outlined is happening at the federal level. And so this strategic report is due February of next year, 2022, and it is supposed to provide a baseline assessment of currently protected areas, both land and ocean, and affirm opportunities and best locations to increase protection, funding, and policy tools. And the answer to the question that we are all asking, right? Like, what is conservation? What should count? Now, of course, the success of all of this depends on engaging stakeholders to share their knowledge, concerns, recommendations, especially at the local level. So the state is launching a round of workshops to cultivate input on meeting the state's commitment to conserve 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by 2030, and to accelerate these nature-based solutions to address climate change. So we have a lot of information at surfrider.org. I am happy to put links in the chat. I'm also happy to answer, any California-specific questions, but at this point, I'll just leave it at that high-level overview and wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, we can also, I'll send an email out afterward with the webinar recording and Levi and Lewis's policy report, and we can include your materials too, so folks can, have those right in your inbox.
Thank you.
Yeah, so California is a really good example, and I do want to kind of continue the discussion about how state and local lands and waters are going to be a part of this. And Gabe, I was hoping you would talk a little bit, share your thinking about how local government can innovate and should have agency around pursuing some of these 30 by 30 goals. I also saw recently they were counting like the local supporters of 30 by 30. So there's like 450 state and local officials that support it, 70 mayors. So it's definitely gaining a lot of traction with local officials.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. And it is a really critically important time for local leaders to step up in this effort. The city of Las Cruces, which I represent here with a population of just over 100,000 people per the last census, the second largest city in New Mexico, is lucky to have a council, a body of a local government that strongly supports local conservation efforts and has for quite some time. In fact, this city has a long history of supporting conservation. When it first came to the Oregon Mountain Desert Peaks National Monument, one of the Obama era areas of land, more than 500,000 acres protected, several, at least more than 240,000 protected as wilderness now, have had strong support from our local community. And that has been for a variety of different reasons, right? And it was great to have President Obama at that time designate that national monument. Our visitation to our regional, to our local monument here has increased by 300% in the areas where we have the Bureau of Land Management actually record visitation. What that means for our local economy is tremendous, right? And so as a local elected official, yes, the outdoor recreation part of what you get to do on protected areas, mountain biking and hiking and birding and hunting, is a really special thing for a local leader to take on. But there are smaller ways of also continuing in that path of conservation that I think the Department of Interior is going to outline in terms of how local governments can continue to champion these efforts, even if it's not a national monument or national conservation area or the expansion of a wildlife refuge or whatever it might be. And so I'm encouraging my colleagues on the council and myself as well to think about the expansion of local urban parks, of repurposing retention and detention ponding areas, of looking at multi-purpose irrigation ditches, right, which we have tons of here in New Mexico, the restoration of native habitat in existing urban areas and parks, and the creation of more open space. I am lucky to have 2 old wells that weren't operational since I think the late 70s, because when they drilled these wells, the water was too briny and had too many minerals, lead and arsenic and a couple of other things, that it was just too costly for us to filter. But in the process, the city bought a whole bunch of land right in the middle of one of our most low income to middle class neighborhoods in the city, and set it aside and said you couldn't use it because one of these days, you know, if we ever need to flush these wells, this is where the water will be stored. When I first got on the council, I said that has to be a local park, right? That has to be a green space for people to enjoy. And in fact, people were already walking their dogs and trail running and doing all kinds of stuff there, right? And so the Villa Mora Dam Park, and Tanya, I think I may have sent you a slide if you don't mind pulling that up.
Yep, I had it ready. Give me 2 seconds.
So, yeah, so I'll just talk while you pull that up. So the Villa Mora Dam Park does sit adjacent to Highway I-25, Interstate 25. And as you can see, the density of residential population that surrounds it, this is one of our most middle-class neighborhoods here in Las Cruces. This entire area, as you, if you were to drive by it today, again, has 2 old wells and a lot of mesquite and a lot of creosote and a lot of greasewood, which is a whole other story. It's actually a byproduct of grazing in this area before this area was even developed, when the Spanish first came. And then later on, Americans, sheep and cows have just decimated some of our native habitat here. So what we're going to do with this particular project is we're going to restore the Chihuahuan Desert habitat, so that we can have things like scaled quail and Gambel's quail and roadrunners and hawks, and just create like a little micro living, almost like a wildlife habitat certified by the National Wildlife Federation, right? But we're also going to include trails. We're going to include biking areas. We're going to give folks in this neighborhood a way to enjoy this landscape, but do so in a sustainable way and restore this amazing piece of land. And then the equity piece comes in, that the folks who are adjacent to this neighborhood, you know, they don't get new parks built all the time. Transportation is a real issue, especially when it comes to accessing the newer parts of town that do have better parks. And I'll just say, maybe not better, but more finely manicured with more amenities and all that kind of stuff, right? And so I just wanted to show this as an example, Tanya, of how local governments can contribute to the 30 by 30 effort in an equitable way that also promotes biodiversity and includes an outdoor recreation component. It's a win-win for our community, win-win for wildlife, and hopefully, if this is replicated 1,000 times over in communities all across the US, we begin to chip away in a different way than just through federal designations.
Yeah, I love that. And it really gets to the piece also about making it relevant to human beings, which we've been talking about a lot. I think let's talk a little bit about we've been kind of throwing out this idea over the last couple of weeks of like what a micro contribution might be to 30 by 30. Something like this open space park, Gabe, that you're talking about. And I think often we've thought about conservation as these like huge landscapes, huge wilderness landscapes. And what's the role that these smaller parks and public lands and open spaces will play in making 30 by 30 successful? This isn't directed to anyone in particular, maybe Gabe or Louis or Levi. I know we've like talked about this quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just like part of the promise of 30 by 30, and part of what's like exciting about it, right? Is it's like it's not just that, this makes a contribution and it's important, but like this is essential, right? Like we cannot get to 30 by 30 if all we're focusing on is federal designations, or especially if all we're focusing on is like wilderness. Like it's just like it's not possible. And so it's like we have to pursue this goal at like all of these different scales, and pursuing, I think what we're excited about this sort of like micro contribution idea is like, the pathway to success here and like durable success, it's contingent on people being vested in the success of 30 by 30. And people need to be able to like look to examples like the park Gabe just laid out, and be able to like connect that back in their mind to 30 by 30 and say like, this is making my life better right now. And if like all we do is pursue like big contentious federal policy wins, not only are we not going to get there, but we're also going to, not going to build the political support that's going to be essential for ultimate success. And it's not to say that we don't want to take on those big contentious federal landscape fights, like we will for sure, but like pursuing this at all these different scales it's going to be the key to success.
Yeah, those are great examples, and I'll just add that the president's budget plan. Gabe mentioned earlier that there was going to be funding for the USGS, but it also mentioned for the first time that private lands are going to be a part of this equation, right? And so it specifically spelled out that there's going to be incentives for private landowners, ranchers, farmers, and others. So it kind of just builds on that, on these concepts of scale that we're talking about. And you can kind of think about two really good important points here, right? That there's many paths to 30 by 30, and then this idea on concepts of scale where we're looking at local, state, and federal all playing a valuable role in this.
And to, just to close the circle and bring it back to the conversation earlier about, what counts as protection. It's very much our belief that like however we define protection, it needs to happen in accordance with, the science underpinning 30 by 30, like the biodiversity needs. And it's not our ambition in any way to like water that down. But at the same time, there needs to be a way for, these micro contributions, for these local parks, for these flexible protective designations to be incorporated into this goal in some way, so that they count, so that people can draw that line from like these projects that are popular and successful directly back to 30 by 30 and say, this is something that's benefiting me right now. Like people who care about conservation in the abstract or biodiversity in the abstract, but maybe don't roll out of bed thinking about biodiversity, but do roll out of bed thinking about going for a trail run or whatever. So
yeah, just to touch on that, one of the things that I think we'll hear more and more about is how management plays in, right? Because if we set aside areas that are, that meet on paper, meet these goals, but they're not effectively managed, then we won't really be doing the good work that could be done, right? And that's why the science is so important, so that we're choosing the right places and that we're monitoring and we're funding the efforts that are needed to properly manage them, so that people really can see and absorb and learn and access the richness that is out there in the natural world. Whether it's, I just went for a walk this morning at a local, it's the United Indian Health Services. They have a small area where they have built some public trails, and it's like 10 miles from my house, but I had never been there before for some reason, and it was amazing. And they have all the signs about the natural plant, or the native plants and the wildlife, and it's so, I mean, you could walk the whole thing in half an hour. But it was so incredible, and it's just such a good example. And they have put a ton of resources into creating and managing this. And of course, we need to see that in the large scale efforts as well. But I think that especially as the conversation about how to maintain spaces for human use while still protecting them for conservation needs evolves, that the management element will be such a huge and important part of the conversation.
And I'll just add the work that Outdoor Alliance did, as did so many other advocates, to get full funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, as well as some of our congressional champions, including, I'll have to give a big shout out to my folks here in New Mexico, Senator Heinrich and former Senator Udall, as well as former Representative Holland, now Secretary of Interior, to fully fund that program. And outdoor recreationists were a big part of that equation. And to restore the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program, right, which was also, there was an attempt to roll that back in the last administration. That is the catalyst to fund those urban parks, to fund those urban expansions at a level that we haven't seen before. The Land and Water Conservation Fund used to be one of the biggest tools for local governments to be able to create green space in their communities and access, right? And so with the prioritization of underserved communities to receive those funds, create those green spaces, help meet a 30 by 30 goal, again, you're meeting some of the really amazing priorities, Jennifer, like you mentioned, perhaps at the Indian Health Center, where you can enjoy those trails at a place where folks don't necessarily have to travel long distances, or don't have to go on a long backpacking excursion or something, or so that those are really important pieces. And so I'm super glad that OA did the work to put, and everyone did the work to get LWCF full funded, because now it's going to be one of our biggest tools to actually get 30 by 30 done. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's so vital for making conservation relevant to people too, that conservation isn't just something that happens in these faraway places, but it should be happening, where you live, where there are population centers. So just keeping an eye on the time, I know we could talk forever about this, but I do want to give folks some time to ask questions. There's one question which I'll pose, it's for Gabe, but encourage folks who are listening to just put a question in the question box if you have one, because we have 10 or so minutes to go over them. So a question for Gabe that came in via the chat. Paul, appreciate your testimony on the park and was wondering about the connection between 30 by 30 and recreating a natural space in spaces that are currently brownfields in Chicago.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point there, Paul, on the role that the EPA might have to play in this, right? Because EPA is the agency now under Secretary Regan that has authority over brownfields and that has funds made available to local communities for brownfield work. And so how a local community envisions the reuse of spaces that perhaps previously have been contaminated through a variety of different ways is also really important. I'll tout a brownfield project near me that I think has tremendous potential. And that's the former Sarco mine in El Paso, Texas, about 25 miles south of my community. The type of lead contamination that exists there from a copper smelter that operated since the 1920s. In fact, Pancho Villa is said to have worked at the Sarco smelter in El Paso. That's how long this thing goes back. Also a time of complete lawlessness, no regulations. But this entire site in that's nestled in the Sangre de Cristo, or the Mount Sangre de Cristo and Franklin Mountains is almost unusable unless you were to turn it into a bike track, right? You could actually put enough dirt on top of this thing to use it for recreational BMX riding. And so you couldn't put houses on it. You couldn't really put anything else on it. And so the city of El Paso is working on a proposal to do brownfield remediation there and turn that into a BMX bike track, which would be an amazing repurposing of that particular site. So hopefully in the city of Chicago and other places, local leaders would have an important role to play in restoring those areas, and as much as you can, again, making those ecologically viable for not just human users, but for the species that we all coexist with as well.
Thanks, Gabe. And thanks, Jennifer, for putting some examples in the chat of turning brownfields into green space. Another question that came in is, how do we as advocates ensure that local access to nature rises above the political fray in DC and remains a priority? Yeah, Louis, I don't know if you have an answer here, because the question is a little bit about like how do you approach this conservation project in a way that's a little more fair, make sure it pays attention to local communities. Gabe, that's something you've been talking about a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if the question is about, access versus conservation, or is it more, I guess I'm more about just keeping recreation and conservation a priority in DC.
The question is, how do we as advocates ensure that local access to nature rises above the political fray in DC and remains a priority?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's like, it's such a big question, right? Like that's like sort of what we roll out of bed thinking about every day, right? It's like, how do we keep this stuff a priority in DC? And it's like, it's sort of a tired answer, but it really is like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, It's like we just have to keep showing up and like, building relationships with your elected officials, encouraging your community to be consistently reaching out to elected officials, like, working to highlight, these success stories, like, whether that's local conservation efforts or, recreation and access efforts, talking about the benefits of the outdoor recreation economy, not just in terms of direct outdoor recreation jobs, but the importance of like making livable, vibrant communities that attract, employers and workers like across a huge range of industries. I mean, I think we all have a really compelling story to tell about the benefits of outdoor recreation and conservation, directly in our own lives. And, it's certainly been my experience that there is, a receptive audience for that in DC.
Yeah.
Translating that to rising above the political fray is a tougher challenge for sure. But you just got to kind of keep at it, I think.
Yeah.
I would just add real quickly too that those of us who have good relationships and have connections with decision makers should continue to use our voices to make sure that all people are being represented to the extent possible, because a lot of folks in disadvantaged communities, there's a ton of great organizations, working in those areas specifically, but whatever we can do to be good allies in that realm, I think is helpful.
Yeah, I want to get to an ocean conservation question because it was something that had actually discussed prior to the webinar. Katie asked, is there any concern about gaining community local support for 30 by 30 efforts? For example, we can see that the surfing community and fishing community are tightly linked, and there's been fear from those communities surrounding the creation of MPAs and how that will threaten livelihoods and recreation. Some of this may be rooted in misunderstanding of the roles and benefits of MPAs, but are you worried about uproar or pushback from these communities hindering the progress of conservation efforts?
Do you want me to take that one, Pete?
You want to start, Jen?
Sure. Well, as a veteran of the California Marine Life Protection Act implementation process, I can speak to both the conflict and the resolution that I have experienced around the creation of marine protected areas. And I think up there we know there's a lot of fear and concern on the front end, where we've been hearing it since this was announced. And a large part of that is because it's still so much is unknown. And I think once we start having a better idea of what protection will look like, what will count, etc., that we'll be able to have, ideally, like discussions like this that are respectful and looking for common ground, and recognizing that, people on both sides that love the outdoors might use the outdoors in different ways, but we all have this unifying love of nature and wanting to recreate and wanting to protect the ocean and the coast. And for me, that was really the path forward in California to getting to a unified proposal on the North Coast about the marine protected areas and finding that common ground. So I know it can be done. And it's really just about having the right people in the room to have conversations in which we recognize we have more in common than we don't. And I know that sounds corny, but it really is how it works.
Yeah. And I, similar to Jennifer, I spent roughly a decade in Oregon working on the marine protected area process. And, I can tell you, you have to have some community buy-in, and you have to bring stakeholders to the table, and they have to feel like they have a real role in the process. I'll also say, in terms of the different, user groups, Surfrider does have people that fish within our network. We don't purport to represent the sort of fishing communities, because there are other groups that sort of more centrally focus on those groups. But we represent a much broader range of users, from beachgoers to wildlife viewers to paddlers and surfers. And, I have seen these sort of processes kind of reduced to environmentalists versus fishermen, which I don't think is necessarily the most useful construct. There's so many other people that have a stake in this process. And part of what we try to do is just get factual information out to people. Here's how the process works. Here's how you can engage, and make sure that people that maybe they don't use the ocean every day, or don't have the opportunity to go to the beach all the time, but they have a real interest in these resources as public resources, and they should know how to engage in that process in a positive way.
Thank you both. I want to squeeze in just one last question, if Levi, you might be able to answer something quickly, because I think this is a really interesting one. The question is, do you know of any inventories of recreation projects, and specifically trail projects, to measure progress and contribution from outdoor advocates toward the 30 by 30 goal, or other tracking tools? This question resonates with me because I feel like I ask you that question like every week.
Yeah, no, when LWCF was going through authorization, I think, Tanya, actually, we looked into this and tried to find shovel-ready projects on the ground. And honestly, this inventory, folks have tried to do it on a national scale, but I don't think there's any official place that you could go to learn more about this. And in terms of tracking it to 30 by 30, I think we're just not there yet in terms of having more guidance from the agency.
Maybe something we can work on now.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, we're just about out of time. I just want to thank you all again so much for sharing your insight on this. I feel like we could have talked for another hour at least. Thank you for being here, and thank you for everyone who joined us today, and hopefully working together toward conserving more land for so many reasons. So thank you all. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Gracias.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Hasta luego.